Welcome to another episode of UFC Open Mat. I'm Adam Catterall. With me, as ever, Nick Pete and the one and only Mr. Dan Hardy. Gentlemen, great to be back in your presence. As we get stuck into UFC 249, don't forget UFC 249 will be on BT Sport, 1 o'clock in the early hours of Sunday morning. Saturday night, make sure you come and join us for the prelims, and then at 3 o'clock it all gets underway with the main card. And that's where this programme is going to concentrate on that main event. Tony Ferguson taking on Justin Gaethje. Dan, let's be honest, it's not the main event that we all wanted. We wanted to see Khabib in this one, but as a second runner, it's not a bad one, is it?
It's not a bad matchup at all. And it's, we're fortunate we've still got two of the best lightweights in the world, fighting off for a very important position. And a lot of the things that Tony would have had to do against Khabib, he'll probably have to do against Gaethje. He's going to have to deal with more stand-up in this fight than wrestling, but that forward pressure is still going to be the same. So I think it's going to be an interesting test for Tony Ferguson. And I keep saying it, I also think Justin Gaethje is a real threat to the title.
Nick, the way that this has come about has been extremely bizarre because, as we know, Tony versus Khabib has been made 5 times. It's all fallen off. April 18th was the original date in Brooklyn. Then it was Techi Palace in California. Now we've got this new date. Psychologically, from Tony's point of view, I know that he's a different breed, but do you think it'll affect him?
Tony Ferguson, you're joking, aren't you?
Yeah.
Nothing like this would affect him at all. He will not be affected at all. And you know what? Neither will Justin Gaethje. They're not that type of fighter. They're not precious. They're not guys that do a heavy amount of game planning anyway. These are just guys that like to throw down. They get in great shape. They put in great fights. As you say, the two top upper echelon 155-pounders. It's a dream that the UFC are able to make this fight under the present circumstances. But you know what? Tony Ferguson, for me, on his day, is the best lightweight in the world. But as Dan's just pointed out, Justin Gaethje's a freak, man. The guy just keeps on coming. He's got no quit in him whatsoever. And he's going to test Tony Ferguson. You better believe it. I think it's going to be a hell of a fight. We mentioned it before. There's going to be clarets everywhere, but it's going to be fun. This is what the UFC is all about. It's the perfect main event for me.
Well, Dan's going to give us a full technical breakdown in a moment or two. I just want to give a little bit of history for fans that are watching this on these two guys. Nick, I'll come to you first because before he got to the UFC, Justin Gaethje was undefeated. What have you made of his tenure so far?
As you say, before he came into the UFC, we were already talking about him. He was in World Series of Fighting. He was their champion. But not only that, every fight he seemed to have in that organisation was a highlight reel. This is why they call him the human highlight reel. Every year he was in fights that was contending for Fight of the Year, and he was winning them. Probably the most important thing here, he was winning big, exciting fights even before he got into the UFC. Now he's arrived in the UFC. He's kind of become the most avoided man. He's only lost against 2 guys, 2 top-level lightweights as well. But he's taken a little bit of time to find his feet. But now he's here. He's evolved his game once again. Before he got here, it was all about forward pressure and momentum. Now he's just a little bit sweeter with it as well. He just thinks about what he's doing that little bit more. He's matured that little bit more, and it's taken him to the next level. Just through pure passion, desire, and skill alone, he became one of the best lightweights in the world. Now, with a little bit of thought going into it, with a little bit more, tempered pressure, if you like, he's reached the upper echelons of the sport, and he's going to put real pressure on Tony Ferguson.
Dan, there seems to be a real change in his attitude, Justin Gaethje, as Nick's just alluded to there. After the back of those back-to-back defeats in his first 3 fights as well, he just seems to have maybe changed his attitude as to, rather than be wanting to be the fight of the night guy or the most entertaining fighter in the world, he's now got his eyes firmly set on UFC gold.
Well, I think this is one of the drawbacks of being an undefeated fighter. And I'm always excited to see, a fighter that's been on a win streak for a long time coming off a loss, because I want to see what it's added to their game. And, Justin Gaethje came into the UFC, I think he was like 18-0 coming into the UFC. So the system of fighting that he'd been using had been working, and it had worked every single time he'd been out in there. So there was no, if it's not broken, all that, there was never any reason to change it. And he was quite lucky against Michael Johnson because he was almost out of that in that first round. So he didn't learn that lesson in that fight because, that it's like being waterboarded, you know what I mean? Just having someone constantly walking towards you, never allowing you any space to breathe or anything. Like, that style works well because it's Homer Simpson. People get tired of punching him. And, you know, but sometimes those punches get through, and when they do, they can hurt him. But because he'd not learned that lesson up until his losses, there was never a reason to change that style. So he got through the Michael Johnson fight, you know, without having to learn that lesson. But then, you know, the next fight was, he picked up a loss, still didn't quite learn the lesson, because I'm sure, you know, he expected to pick up a loss at some point. But then a second loss pointed out, really, it's the method in which he was using was a bit too hard-headed for this level of competition. And, you know, I mean, and it's done him wonders, because his most recent 3 wins, it's literally like the second stage of his career.
Yeah.
You know, he came through the preliminary stage of his career, building this reputation for himself. But then, you know, I mean, I'm sure we've had this discussion on the show before. Sometimes the expectation of a fighter can kind of work against them. Like, if you're Darren Elkins and you tattoo the damage on your chest, you can't be a finesse counter striker. You just can't do it, you know? If your nickname's the highlight reel, you've got to deliver highlights. I mean, this is the expectation that you put on your shoulders. So he shows up to the octagon every time with the intention of making the fight exciting. But it's very rare you have an exciting fight where both people don't take a beating. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think he's matured in his approach, and I don't think he's necessarily living up to the nickname quite as much in his own head. It doesn't mean he's not delivering the highlights like we've seen, but I don't think he's as adamant to put himself at risk anymore, which is doing him a lot of favours.
We now know why you've got a skull and crossbones tattoo on your body, mate.
Because I'm a pirate, that's why.
You just mentioned Michael Johnson's name there. Obviously, that's the last guy to beat Tony Ferguson nearly 8 years ago. It's been an unbelievable run for Tony. But recently, he's only fought once a year. What do you make of that activity, Dan?
I don't think it suits him personally. I think Tony Ferguson's much better at being active regularly, because a lot of his style is about decision making in the moment and about the right technique at the right moment, the timing of everything. Because he has so many things in his arsenal. Like, if you look at Tony Ferguson compared to Khabib, Tony's got this vast amount of technique that he can utilize. You know, various different types of striking attacks. Obviously, we know his ground game's chaotic. We know his takedown defense is chaotic. So there are a lot of different facets to his game. But someone that's got such a diverse game, they have to make decisions very quickly during the fight. Justin Gaethje's game is far more straightforward. It's about using his left hook to make people headbutt his overhand right and low kicking them until they can't stand up anymore. I mean, that's literally, like, you can define his style in a couple of sentences. So, like Justin Gaethje can take that style to the octagon every time and roll it out, and it'll work against almost everybody. Tony, I think, gets better if he's more active. And I think that first round is always a danger for Ferguson. Like, I always go back to the Lando-Vannata fight. Now, Vannata took that fight against Tony Ferguson on short notice. And that was one of the closest times he's got to losing the fight that he didn't lose. He got dropped in the first round. Same thing happened with Pettis. And I think a part of that is getting tagged in the first round because his timing's not quite there. And I think regularity of competition helps him with that. And that's another concern for me with him being out for a while, is that if Gaethje lands that one shot, he might not be able to forward roll himself to safety.
Nick, you brought up a little earlier, obviously, Justin Gaethje's change of attitude, especially over the last 3 fights. History would tell us that he's got a decent wrestling game, but he's never really used that in the UFC. Do you think he might use it in this fight against Tony Ferguson?
I think even if he does, Tony Ferguson's more than capable on the ground himself. You know, look at his record. There's as many submissions as there is knockouts. You know, he loves a Darce choke, and he's more than accomplished on the ground, Tony Ferguson. That's the issue Gaethje's going to have. You know, we often talk about Gaethje's wrestling when he's getting talked about matched up with Conor McGregor. Now it could be the one facet that pushes him over the edge. But against Tony Ferguson, who's well-rounded everywhere, I don't really see it as a strength. And I don't really think Justin Gaethje, throughout his career, even his second stage of his career, he's not shown a part of us where he's gone at wrestling heavy. So I wouldn't expect them to do it in this fight at all. Just what Dan was saying, there's a good point, though, about Tony Ferguson, that sharpness. And I agree with Dan. And maybe had the Khabib fight, 5th time of asking, actually came off this time around, if Khabib maybe was still in California and it was those two going head-to-head, maybe that would have been a bad thing for Tony Ferguson, not having that sharpness. Maybe going in against Justin Gaethje first, if he can get a win at 249. Maybe that sets him up perfectly for the end-of-year showdown with Khabib, because he'll have that sharpness that Gaethje brings to the table. So it's a kind of a win-win in that regard, in terms of Tony Ferguson's preparation for the title fight, for the full title. But Gaethje is absolutely no mug, as you said before. You know, he's going to turn up absolutely guns blazing. He knows what this is about because, listen, the winner of this fight more than likely fights Khabib. The loser of this fight more than likely fights Conor McGregor. Both these guys are in a fantastic position.
You know what? I would actually say it's a bit more dangerous for Tony the opposite way around. I think it would be easier for him to fight Khabib at this stage because Khabib's going to come with a heavy wrestling game, which will allow him that first round to kind of get his timing back. And he's not going to have huge bombs being thrown at him as well that could take his head off in the first round. Whereas Gaethje's going to use his wrestling to keep this fight standing. I don't see why he would try and get tangled up in Tony Ferguson's ground game, because if he tries to take the fight down, he's defending his neck immediately, and if he's defending takedowns, then Tony's forcing the point, and that's, you know, he's got to use his wrestling defensively. He's got to stay inside the kicking range of Tony Ferguson, but outside of the elbow range. I mean, that's the Goldilocks zone for Gaethje in this fight. I think if he gets too close to Tony Ferguson, he gets problematic with elbows, with cuts. You know, like, this is something else I noticed because I've watched all of Gaethje's UFC fights recently, and you see certain things that roll on from one fight to the next. So if you watch the fight against Eddie Alvarez, he got a pretty bad cut over his eye. Within 90 seconds of the Poirier fight starting, the same cut had opened up, and he even wipes at it and acknowledges that he's cut, like it's an expectation. Mm-hmm. If you're fighting Tony Ferguson, who's got elbows like he has, and you get too close to him, like, that scar tissue is ready to burst open. You know, that's part of the danger of the style that he has. And I think, you know, like, Tony Ferguson can be crowded a little bit. You can crowd him and make him uncomfortable. But if you get too close, he also gets very dangerous.
So, Dan, with that in mind then, you know, obviously who wins this will face Khabib. So which one is the more difficult fight, in your opinion, technically wise, for Khabib?
Yeah, I think they're different kinds of challenges. You know, obviously Tony Ferguson's the antithesis of Khabib. You know, Khabib comes forward, he wrestles hard, he puts you in bad positions, beats you up, and then exposes your back. Tony Ferguson throws wild stuff that catches you with sharp edges of you know, elbows and knees, and wraps your neck up and stuff. So I think that Khabib's game fits into Tony's quite well, and it's either one's going to win or the other one's going to win based on which one has more success. And I know that's not a great answer, but if you compare that to the way that Gaethje and Khabib would play out, that's much more of a head-to-head, because Khabib is trying to take Gaethje down, and Gaethje's trying to stop Khabib taking him down and trying to knock him out. I think Khabib gets far less of his way against Gaethje when it comes to the wrestling game, whereas I think he might be able to get into a wrestling game with Ferguson, but then get tangled up in stuff. I think that Gaethje could cause him some real problems, because I think he's got the wrestling to be able to keep Khabib standing, and we know he's got the power to knock people out. And you know, Khabib's kind of in the same situation that Gaethje was when he first came into the UFC. You know, it's not broken, so he hasn't fixed it. Like, Khabib is getting better, but a loss at this stage would show him holes in his game that he's not even thinking about. And I think that, you know, Gaethje's already had those losses. He's already turned that corner, and he might be the one to then, you know, give that opportunity to Khabib.
Nick, away from these two, is there anybody else down that lightweight roster that could cause Khabib any problems? We've seen him obviously in with Dustin Poirier. We've seen him in with Conor. Where are the other challenges for him?
Listen, Dan Hooker's making good waves at the moment, isn't he? You know, I would like to see Conor back in with Khabib at some stage, just purely based on the manner in which he went into that first fight, out of the sport for 2 years, focused on boxing for the best part of a year. I think it was, you know, in hindsight, rather arrogant of Conor to think that he could just jump straight in, back in with a guy who's so ruthless as Khabib, but has got this incredible, you know, you don't want to say he's a one-trick pony, Khabib, because it's a hell of a trick. But there is no blueprint to beat Khabib, and that makes him so much more difficult. So I would like to see Conor come back with a full camp, prepare properly for Khabib. But the problem is, who do you get in to prepare for Khabib? Because he is kind of so unique. Just come back to that question you just asked Dan as well, in terms of Gaethje and Tony Ferguson. I've got to go the other way. I've got to go with Tony Ferguson. For me, Tony Ferguson's the best lightweight on the planet. Technically, he's just so good. He can take his shot. He can fight anywhere. And I think he creates a lot of problems for Khabib on the feet. But he's more than capable of living with Khabib's top pressure on the ground as well. You know, you can beat on Tony Ferguson, and still his brain is ticking away on how to grab your arm, grab your neck, how to advance his own position. He's never a defensive fighter. He's always in offense, even when he's on the back foot. And for that reason, I think he's a huge threat to Khabib, which is so disappointing that the fight's fallen off 5 times already, you know. Do we even make it a 6th time? Do we even run that chance of it falling off again? I don't know. But the only way we kind of get there is if Tony Ferguson makes a statement against Gaethje and then he says, listen, man, whatever happens, let's just make it again. We've got to see the fight because I'm the best lightweight on the planet. And if he does Gaethje in fine style, there's a real argument for it as well.
You know, there's one other guy we've got to keep an eye on that we've not mentioned. Dan Hooker's a good shout, but we've also got to remember Charles Oliveira. Like, and what he just did to Kevin Lee, it puts him right up in the contender bracket for me. I think he's managed to bring that excellent submission game together with a really nice striking skill set now. And I think he's, you know, I mean, him against Tony Ferguson would be a hell of a fight because they're both excellent on the ground. They've both got great striking skills as well now. And I think that, you know, I mean, that's an exciting fight for the future. But Charles Oliveira is definitely one we've got to be keeping an eye on.
How does this fight then kind of affect the rest of the lightweight division? Nick, I'll come to you because you mentioned Conor's name there. He's not actually back at lightweight, but do you imagine him to be so by the back end of the year?
Well, it's impossible to say at the moment because, of course, I don't know whether, you know, Conor was adamant at the start of the year he was going to have at least 3 fights this year. Obviously, that's been completely put to one side. Now, be lucky, really, if we see him again before the end of the year, I would have thought, due to the current climate. But you never know, you know, whether Conor McGregor's too big a star to appear on Fight Island. You know, potentially he may just be a step too far for him. We may have to wait until we can get back inside arenas in Las Vegas before we see Conor again. But in terms of the rest of the lightweight division, you know, for me, it absolutely defines who's next for Khabib, of course. And I think the loser comes out of it and he's not going to be short on suitors. You know, Dustin Poirier's chomping at the bit. There's a strong lightweight division below here, and they're all after 2 things. One, they're either after Khabib and their shot at the title, or 2, and alternatively, and probably even a bigger score, is the Conor McGregor fight. You know, everybody wants the Conor McGregor phone call. As usual, he's the biggest star in the sport. He brings the biggest payday in the sport. And it's all about whether Conor is coming back down to 155 anytime soon, or whether he's still going to stay flirting at welterweight. That's kind of like the $1 million question.
So let's have a look at the technicalities of the fight then, Dan, shall we? Because both of these guys are extremely well-rounded. We hope, as fans, when you see those names on the card, that it's absolutely blood and thunder on the feet, and they're just whacking the living daylights out of each other for 25 minutes. First of all, do you think it'll go 25 minutes? And if not, how do you think it plays out?
You know what? It could quite easily go the full distance. It's going to be a messy fight if it goes 25 minutes. I think it's going to be a messy fight if it goes 10 minutes. I think both of these guys are susceptible to getting hit and getting cut. They've both got big holes in their game, which is one of the reasons why they're so exciting. Like, Tony Ferguson comes striding forward with big, long, wild punches. Gaethje is always putting himself at harm's way. So I think it's going to be a messy fight, and I think there are a lot of ways for both of these guys to get the finish and to be beaten. For Justin Gaethje, any kind of tangling with Tony Ferguson on the floor, I just don't think it's wise. I think he needs to, like I said, maintain that kind of Goldilocks zone of being inside the kicking range of Tony Ferguson, so he's not constantly getting prodded in the midsection with that front kick, but not getting so close that he's susceptible to the elbows. I mean, I think he can smother Tony inside, but I still think it's risky. He needs to be in boxing range and pressuring. For Tony Ferguson, I think he needs to create some space for himself, but then ultimately, you know, it's all about neck attacks for Tony Ferguson. And the good thing is, if you attack Justin Gaethje, almost every single time, he lowers his head and tucks his hands up. And Tony Ferguson's going to be looking at that in different ways that he can wrap that neck up. And I tell you what, like, from rolling with the 10th Planet guys, their neck attacks are super quick, like very, very fast. They don't mess about by setting it up and getting the hand position right. As soon as the arm's under the neck, they're squeezing, they're making it uncomfortable. And that's when Tony kind of starts to find himself in good positions because Gaethje's trying to bail out of chokes and keep himself safe. I think there's a lot of different ways for Tony Ferguson to win this one. I think the big danger is that big knockout in the first round where Gaethje just doesn't give him any space and comes over with the overhand right. Like think the Vic fight. You know, he tested that right hand a couple of times to see which way he'd circle out, and he knew that he was going to be susceptible to that right when he stepped in. Like, Tony's not as predictable, definitely, but he could still be caught with that big shot. And, you know, and we know when Tony's hurt because he does crazy stuff like forward rolls and, you know, and I think if it gets to that stage, then Gaethje's at the moment, at this point in his career, got the presence of mind to pick his shots. Maybe before his losses, perhaps not, but at this point, he's far more dangerous at delivering the finish. So no, I don't think it's going to go the distance. I think Tony Ferguson's either going to find a neck or get a couple of nasty elbows in there and open up a cut. But Gaethje, that first round is where his finishing is going to be for sure.
Nick, do you go along with that? Because obviously Justin Gaethje's been called in kind of last minute in a way, and he's not really had an opportunity to get sparring partners in with everything that's going on with the world health pandemic. He's not been able to get those guys in to come up with or train a suitable game plan. Is it a case of, listen, get in there and go for it?
Absolutely. And that makes him 200 times more dangerous than at any other period. You know, this stinks of Michael Bisping against Luke Rockhold. For me, like Dan, on paper, I'd have to say Tony Ferguson, 4th round, submission. I can just see Gaethje running out of gas. But you know what? That is if MMA was predictable. That's if MMA wasn't run by these perverse MMA gods that like to just do mad things at mad times. And we've all been waiting for Tony Ferguson versus Khabib for so long now. I think it's 5 or 6 years they've been trying to make that fight. MMA gods are just going to go, nope, sorry, that's the end of that. Gaethje, first round knockout, free money all day. Don't blink. It's going to be mental.
Dan, regarding Tony Ferguson's decision to make a weight cut for the original fight day, will that play any effect going into this fight, doing 2 weight cuts so close together? Will it affect his performance, do you think?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't really know, to be honest. It depends how close he was to the weight and how much he had to cut to make the weight the other week. I mean, this is one of the reasons why it was kind of an uneducated thing to do, because this is where it could potentially be detrimental. It would probably be better having not done the weight cut, because I'm sure he wasn't thinking about having to compete immediately afterwards. So probably his rehydration wasn't quite on point either. So I don't really know, to be honest. I mean, the one benefit is that it makes sure that he's definitely close to championship weight, because we've seen him there, recently. So the likelihood of him stepping on the scales and being over is almost out of the question. So I guess there's a benefit there, but he would have definitely been better not to do the weight cut.
Nick, we saw, I mean, a lot of people follow David Goggins on social media, and he's a fantastic motivator of a fella, and he made a comment, obviously, about that weight cut, and he talked about the psychological aspect of getting inside the opponent of Tony Ferguson, because he was living that savage life. We said right at the start of the show of the psychological effects that this fight would have on either Tony Ferguson or Justin Gaethje. Do you think that, with what Tony did a couple of weeks ago, got inside Justin's head in any way, shape or form?
Nah, not at all. I think Justin Gaethje was probably sitting at home with a nice Dunkin' Donut and a nice coffee, shaking his head saying, what a fool. What's the point? There's absolutely no point to make weight. I'll do it when it matters. It doesn't matter today. If you need to do that, if you need to psychologically make weight yourself to try and prove a point to someone, great. But Justin Gaethje is not that guy. He's not the guy that's going to go to bed worrying about making weight. He's a career wrestler. The guy who makes weight is just like putting butter on his toast. It's perfectly natural to him. He either chuckled at it, he'd had a good laugh at his expense, and he'll think, you know what, I'll make weight when it matters. That's all that he cares about.
Dan, you were obviously in Brazil for the show that happened behind closed doors, and we saw 9 straight decisions on that particular night. And I put that down to maybe some of the fighters not being able to feed off the adrenaline of a crowd being there. Do you think that would affect either of these 2 guys, or does it not come into play at all?
Not with these 2. I think there are some fighters that it would affect, and some fighters wouldn't even notice that they're affected by it. But with these 2, knowing Tony Ferguson and knowing that he's a little bit mad anyway, he's doing this for himself. This is all about Tony Ferguson's legacy, and he would fight anywhere as long as the belt's on the line. With Gaethje, I mean, the last time I spoke to him was after his fight against Cowboy, and there was just a different energy about him. He almost seemed impatient because he wasn't really interested in all of the the nonsense that was going on around the sport. He just wanted to get in there and compete and find his way to the top as quickly as possible. And I think a lot of that impatience comes from those losses that he picked up, because I think he realizes what he was doing wrong, and now he knows what he's doing right. He wants to show everybody that he's the best in the world. That he's got the opportunity to do that because he's got Tony Ferguson in front of him. I don't think they're going to be affected at all by the fact that there's no crowd there. I think, you know, you look down the card, there are definitely some fighters on the card that I would think this is going to be a bit of a game changer for them in one way or another, positive or negative, but not this main event.
Just finally, Dan, on obviously this event going ahead, what a wonderful opportunity for some lesser known names. I mean, if you're a UFC fan, you know all about Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje, but you might be a casual sports fan coming to the weekend because you're absolutely thirsty for live sport. All eyes will be on the UFC, and there's a real opportunity for some of these fighters, as well as the two guys in the main event, to step up and make themselves household names.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, this is going to be news. This is going to be circulated news the day after, like nothing else, because everyone, like you said, everyone's waiting for something different to happen, and live sports dried up. And you know, this is going to be an exciting card. I mean, the matchups that have been made all the way down the card, there's some real explosive fights, some really fun matchups. So I think no matter what happens, even in the main event, we're going to get plenty of stories from this one that are going to be shared. And then, you know, the UFC schedule picks up after that. So it's going to be a pretty ferocious pace. I'm certainly looking forward to having some live fights to watch. I've enjoyed going back and watching some of the archive, but there's nothing like watching something where you don't know what's going to happen. And that's exactly what this card brings.
I know you've both kind of alluded to this throughout the course of the show, and people will have their own opinions as well. And please feel free to leave your comments in the section on YouTube. But Nick, I'll come to you first. You know I'm going to ask for a prediction. You've got to put your backside on the line. You've got to get off the fence, mate. Come on, where is it?
I think Dan's going to go with Tony Ferguson. You know, I think Dan's going to go that way. So you know me. I love to cause a bit of friction, so I'm going to go with the upset, man. I'm going to go with it. Listen, this thing has been thrown together last minute. It's supposed to be Habib, then it was Gaethje somewhere else, then they changed location. No one's talking about Justin Gaethje upsetting the apple cart here. Everyone's talking about Justin Gaethje coming through this fight, losing and getting thrown in with Conor McGregor, which means he's won anyway. But for me, I just think it's just set up perfectly for something absolutely mental to happen. And for me, that mental thing is Justin Gaethje getting a knockout against Tony Ferguson. And I admit, the best lightweight on the planet, Tony Ferguson. But the stars have aligned. The world is not... it's not all black and white. The crazy things happen, especially inside that octagon. And for that reason, I'm going Gaethje by knockout all the way.
There you go. Nick Pete's just gone viral, everybody. Right, what do you reckon, Dan? Nick's right. I'm going to go with my safer bet. The thing, when it comes to closely matched fights like this, I always do if they fought 10 times, who wins the majority? Yeah. And a lot of the time I can say, and when the fights get even less competitive, I go higher. Like me against GSP, it was if I fought him 100 times, I might get him 3 or 4. You know what I mean? Whereas this one, if these guys fought 10 times, I say Tony takes 6 and Gaethje takes 4. Ooh. I think it's that close. I mean, it could even be 5 apiece. Wow. I feel like there are more ways for Tony Ferguson to win. I feel like there are more holes in Justin Gaethje's defense for Tony Ferguson to find his way in. And I feel like Tony Ferguson's odds continue to get better as the fight goes on, and I feel like Gaethje starts to drop off. Like the holes in his game get bigger and more obvious. I can see Tony Ferguson probably hurting him with something and then catching him in a DOS or a guillotine, or I think it might be a neck attack, and I think Gaethje might go to sleep, but he'd have to be hurt first because his neck defense, wrestling defense is good. I'm going to go Tony Ferguson sub in the third, just to be on the opposite side of the fence to Nick. Nick, we can't finish the show without you saying the word claret, mate. Tell them what they can be guaranteed if they tune in to BT Sport.
100% we are guaranteed claret in this fight. Whether it goes early, like I said, or whether it goes around 3-4 rounds. Listen, as Dan just pointed out then, if these guys fought 10 times, I actually believe Tony Ferguson wins 7, maybe even 8 out of the 10. That's how big an advantage I give him, because all round, I think, truly, on his day, the best 155 on the planet. But this is not going to be his day. This is going to be that 1 time in 10 or one of those 2 times in 10 where Justin Gaethje just gets it right. The stars align. It's going to be absolutely mental from start to finish. You think you're desperate to see a fight live? Imagine how these guys feel pacing around backstage. They've been waiting to fight each other for months. It's going to be insane. Don't blink.
I tell you what, if you're a UFC fighter and an underdog going into a fight, you want Nick Peter in your corner.
Of course you do,
because it doesn't matter who you are. He's going to convince you're going to win. Did you have a call with Michael Bisping before your match Rockhold?
Listen, that's what we like to see, a bit of positive energy going into these fights. We've been starved of action for such a long period of time, and now we've finally got it. May the 9th, it all goes down. UFC 249, you can get it on BT Sport. 1 o'clock, come and join us for the prelims, and then, of course, the 3 o'clock start for the main card. And that main card is absolutely sensational, culminating in this fight that we've just been speaking about. Tony Ferguson taking on Justin Gaethje for the interim lightweight championship of the world. We are going to be making more programs on BT Sport and the BT Sport YouTube channel, so make sure you subscribe there. We're going to go through the rest of the card as well, because it's not just all about this main event. There's some absolute bangers on there to get stuck into, so make sure you come and join us next time.